Transferred, destroyed. The time is up. Another Spirit, 320 transferred. What should the team do? Another Spirit, another Spirit, another Spirit, another Spirit, another Spirit, another Spirit. We were with Pete and the worst Chamaili. At night, don't be more afraid because you took it and controlled it, and at the end you wrote with a knife. Where is Chamaili? Now we see its surroundings, but from this side it hasn't surrounded us. How is it? How is it surrounding? The surrounding is another problem. People have another problem and saw gratitude.
In this video, we're going to travel through one of the saddest and most complex legal and political cases of recent years. The story of the downing of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, which became known as PS752. On January 8, 2020, just a few minutes after taking off from Imam Khomeini Airport in Tehran, this plane was shot down by missiles fired by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and all 176 people on board lost their lives. Since that day, the families of the victims have been seeking justice and pursuing both the political and legal aspects of this case, and we've heard various accounts of what happened so far. But what made me interested in making this video right now wasn't the incident itself, but rather the narrative we're currently seeing, where different sources are presenting the outcome of the trial related to this flight. For example, take a look at these tweets.
The verdict for the PS752 plane case has been issued. The Ukrainian airline was found negligent and must pay compensation. Following a lawsuit by the families of the victims, the Ontario Superior Court found the Ukrainian airline responsible due to negligence and failure to properly assess the risks of flying out of Tehran, and ordered the company to pay each victim's family $180,000 as full compensation. The judge emphasized that the Ukrainian airline knew Iran was on high alert and preparing for retaliation following the assassination of General Soleimani, yet still did not cancel its flight and put the passengers' lives at risk.
In all these tweets, it is being portrayed as if the court's verdict has been simplified and that the Ukrainian airline was at fault in the incident, while other individuals who had previously been identified as responsible either by themselves or by the public are depicted as having had no role in the matter, and the innocence of various people is being discussed. Now, in this video, we want to examine whether these claims are actually true, or if it's just another round of media manipulation to distort the main story and present something else instead. Greetings to you all. I am Elias Farouk. This is Persian Trend, and in this video, we want to thoroughly examine the entire story of the Ukrainian flight court cases together, especially the court cases that have been held in Canada and that most people in Iran don't have much specific information about.
Let's start from the beginning.
On the morning of January 8, 2020, or 18th of day 1398 in the Iranian calendar, while tensions between Iran and the United States had escalated after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, flight PS752 with 167 passengers and 9 crew members took off from Tehran heading to Kiev. 7.5 passengers and 9 crew members departed from Tehran for Kiev. Most of the passengers were Iranian. Many of them were Canadian citizens or residents, and a few people from Ukraine and other countries were also on this flight. Just a few minutes after takeoff, 2 missiles from the IRGC air defense struck the plane, and everything came to an end.
At first, everyone said it had crashed due to a technical failure or some other problem. All of these were slaves.
The tensions in Iran are deeply painful.
In Iran, the pain runs so very, very deep. In Iran, the pain is truly, undeniably, and profoundly intense and overwhelming.
At first, everyone said it had crashed because of a technical failure or some other problem. But 3 days later, under pressure from international evidence, the government admitted that missiles from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps caused this tragedy. Of course, everyone talked about human error, not a systematic decision. After that, the Association of Families of the Victims of Flight PS752 was formed very quickly with the goal of seeking truth and justice. This association, whose spokesperson was Hamed Esmaili, one of the grieving fathers from this flight, promised from the very beginning not to let this incident be forgotten. But the question is, how far have these efforts gone, and what has the process been like? You have to look at Canada, where many of the victims or their families live. In 2020, a few people filed a class action lawsuit. Omid Arsalani, who lost his sister, brother-in-law, and niece, filed a lawsuit against Iran and Ukraine International Airlines. In addition, Ali Asghargorji, who was the victim's uncle, also filed a lawsuit only against Iran and later added some officials of the Islamic Republic, like Mr. Khamenei, to the case. Merzad Zareh and Shahin Moghadam later filed lawsuits only against Ukraine International Airlines. In November 2020, the Ontario Superior Court then had to decide which lawsuit would proceed. Judge Gilstein chose the Arsalani lawsuit. Why? Because it accused both Iran and Ukraine International Airlines and had a strong legal team with good financial backing. The Gorgi lawsuit didn't have enough funding, and it had also ignored Ukraine International Airlines, which was a major flaw. Zareh's case was filed late and wanted to merge with Gorgi's, but the court said no, a single focused lawsuit would be better. So the Arsalani case became the official representative. For those who don't know, this explanation needs to be given. Imagine that several lawsuits have been filed over a single incident. Of course, each plaintiff still has the right to continue their lawsuit individually if they wish to pursue it on their own later. But when the Canadian judicial system wants to examine a common issue for everyone, it's better that the issue is centralized, only one case is pursued and brought to a conclusion, and then once this process is completed and finished, anyone who wants can file a lawsuit again in any way they wish. If their claim is valid, it can be pursued through that route as well. Why do they do this? Because a case involving the scale of Flight PS752 or a lawsuit against a large country like Iran, or ultimately pursuing a case against has its own complexities. And if each of these parties wants to pursue the case independently with their own perspectives, a significant portion of the Canadian judicial system might have to get involved just to examine a joint case between several people but in a separate manner, and this carries a very high cost. The judicial systems of European or American countries, unlike the judicial system of the Islamic Republic, are not such that you can file a complaint with just a small amount of money. There, you have to pay heavy fees, and if your complaint is successful, these costs will be reimbursed. Otherwise, you've pretty much lost that money. Now, among several cases that had been filed regarding this incident, the Canadians had to choose one, and they selected the case that had stronger lawyers. In other words, lawyers who had previous experience suing the company. They also had a large budget, which meant they could see the case through to the end. And more importantly, they had filed lawsuits against both the Islamic Republic and the Ukrainian airline, so they could pursue both aspects of the case together, making sure not to focus on just one part and neglect the other. That's why the Canadians chose to proceed with Arsalani's lawsuit and see it through to the end. After that, anyone else who wanted to file a complaint could certainly do so, and their case would also be reviewed. The first verdict was issued. In May 2021, a major event took place. The Ontario court ruled that the shooting down of PS752 was intentional and an act of terrorism. This was the first time an official court had declared this, the downing of Flight 752. This was the first time an official court had declared this. Based on evidence such as the association's report and satellite data, the judge stated that this was not a simple mistake, but rather a deliberate decision. In January 2022, the next step was taken. The court ordered Iran to pay $107 million to the families of 6 victims. This included financial compensation and a penalty for the act of terrorism. But this ruling was not enforced. Why? Because Iran does not have any non-diplomatic assets in Canada, and diplomatic assets cannot be seized under Canadian law. And the Islamic Republic itself does not intend to cooperate with these courts, as it has stated that Canadian courts do not have jurisdiction to review this case since the incident occurred inside Iran. According to Iranian law, or the laws of the Islamic Republic, if an incident occurs in any city or region, only the court in that area has the authority to review the case. Of course, this is what I know. If I'm mistaken, dear lawyers, please leave a comment so I can correct it. Now, this is the general reason why the $107 million was not paid, and we'll discuss it in detail in the next section. Aside from the rulings issued against the Islamic Republic, in June 2024, it was UIA's, or Ukraine International Airlines, turn. After 18 sessions in Ontario, the court ruled that Ukraine International Airlines was also at fault, because in a wartime situation where Iran had attacked American bases, they should not have operated the flight. The judge said that Ukraine International Airlines was unable to prove that it had not been negligent. There is hope that this ruling will be enforced because Ukraine International Airlines is a commercial company and its assets in Ukraine or elsewhere can be seized. So this propaganda we're seeing about how the Canadian court also confirmed that Ukraine International Airlines is at fault and that this company must pay compensation and that no one else is to blame is either incomplete, distorted, or you could say it's a lie. Why? Because the Canadian courts have examined this issue in two separate parts. That means the Islamic Republic is also at fault, which it has itself admitted, and it claims to have put several people on trial. According to the Islamic Republic itself, about 10 military personnel who either gave the order or carried out the missile launch have been prosecuted. So in other words, they have acknowledged this issue. Even Commander Hajizadeh himself admitted responsibility for the missile launch and said, now our necks are thinner than a hair, meaning they're ready to accept the consequences. So it's not like anyone can whitewash this now and claim that it didn't happen or that the Islamic Republic isn't to blame. But aside from the fact that the Islamic Republic is at fault, played its own role, and that the IRGC directly carried out the missile launches, Ukraine International Airlines itself was also to blame and must answer for its own negligence. What was their negligence? They shouldn't have been flying in a war zone. They should have cancelled the flight and saved many lives, but they didn't do that. So aside from the $107 million in compensation that the Islamic Republic must pay to the families of the victims, Ukraine International Airlines is also at fault, played its own role, and must pay its own damages. These two issues are completely unrelated to each other. You can't say that only the Islamic Republic is to blame, so Ukraine International Airlines should be let off the hook and not pay any compensation. Nor can you say that only Ukraine International Airlines is at fault, and the Islamic Republic should be let off and not have to pay compensation. Both parties played their roles and must be held accountable to the extent of their responsibility. But let's move on to the question of why the rulings are not being enforced. For example, why is the $107 million judgment said to have been issued against the Islamic Republic not enforceable? In Canada, the Islamic Republic's assets are either diplomatic or very limited. The Vienna Convention protects embassy property. For instance, they can't sell the embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Canada and give the money to the victims' families. Iran also says it does not accept this ruling and will not cooperate. Iran's non-diplomatic assets in Canada were about $30 million, which have already been seized and are not enough for this judgment either. But you might find it interesting to ask how, in the US, when something happens, they can confiscate Iran's assets or sell parts of Iran's property and give it to those who have filed lawsuits. We know of various incidents where this has happened. They seized the assets, sold them, and paid out the money. How is it that they can do this in the US but not in Canada? It's because the Americans are clever and have included a clause in their law. What is the law? According to the Vienna Convention, no country can sell or confiscate the diplomatic assets of another country or take them for itself. However, the Americans added a clause under this law saying unless that country has committed a terrorist act or has acted in support of terrorism. Based on this very clause, after the 1979 revolution in Iran and the events of the US embassy hostage crisis, the Americans confiscated almost all of Iran's diplomatic assets. They seized and froze all the assets and bonds we had there. And after that, whatever happened or whatever lawsuits were filed based on American court rulings, part of this money or these assets were sold off and given to the people who had filed complaints. This situation is so extensive. For example, from the case of the bombing in Argentina, or those who were taken hostage at the US embassy, or various other incidents that happen elsewhere in the world, and people file lawsuits, or even incidents that happen in the US itself, they take portions of this money. And over the years, they've been living off the several $billion that were frozen there. Of course, there really isn't much left of those several billion dollars, and there are still many people in line waiting to claim their compensation from whatever assets remain. I don't know exactly how much is left before those assets are completely depleted, but the Canadians don't have this exception. So Canada can freely confiscate and sell assets that belong to the Islamic Republic government. If they want to take action with the Islamic Republic's assets outside of Canada or confiscate them, well, that comes with some technical and legal challenges. For example, some people might say that they could seize one of the Islamic Republic's oil tankers in international waters, sell it, and give the money to the families of Flight 752 victims. Technically, that's possible. But here, we're talking about Canada. Canada doesn't have significant military power to confront the Islamic Republic and seize one of its oil tankers because we know that if the Canadians do this, the Islamic Republic will definitely retaliate, either by seizing one of their ships or by taking actions against Canadian interests elsewhere in the world that could harm Canada. After all, Canada is not comparable to the United States. Maybe if the Americans were to take such an action, or for example, if Britain were to seize an oil tanker, they have greater military power, although even they later faced serious problems as a result. For example, when Britain carried out an attack in the Persian Gulf, the Islamic Republic immediately retaliated in kind, and in the end, we never really understood whether it ended in a one-to-one draw or if any damages were paid. We really don't know these things. We don't have access to that information. But what is clear is that Canada does not have the capability to do such a thing, and perhaps it also lacks the necessary political will to carry it out. Some people ask, why doesn't it do this through the United States? For example, they say that the Canadian court could ask the US government to take a portion of the funds that are frozen in the US and give it to the survivors of Flight 752. First of all, technically this is possible, but there are so many cases already in line to receive compensation from the Islamic Republic in the US that if Canada wanted to do this, it would have to go to the back of the line. It's not clear when its turn would come, and from the money that was frozen there, honestly, not much is left, and it's uncertain whether the US would even want to give that money to a foreign country. Certainly, if the US wants to use that money for lawsuits that have been filed within its own territory, it will allocate it for that purpose. And if the families of the victims want to pursue this, it's better for them to file their lawsuits in American courts. And now, if the Americans decide whether to give this money or not, that's up to them. And if they want to pursue it through Canada, it probably won't lead to any particular result. Overall, I tried in this video to give you a general explanation of the lawsuits that have been filed and the events that have happened in this case. Of course, certainly, some verdicts were also issued inside Iran. For example, it was said that 10 people were convicted by the courts of the Islamic Republic. But we don't know who these individuals were or what their sentences were. The trial was not held transparently, and there wasn't much specific information released about it. That's why many countries didn't accept it, or the families of the victims didn't accept it, saying that the main culprits were not brought to this court. We don't know, because we didn't see this trial and we're not aware of the details of what happened. Definitely. But even those 10 people who were convicted, it wasn't clear who they were, what exactly their sentences were, and in the end it was dismissed and forgotten, and there was no specific information released. The important point here is that the Islamic Republic set a compensation of $150,000 for each of the deceased, but most of the victims' families did not accept it. As far as I know, except for a few individuals, the rest did not accept it and decided to pursue their complaints through courts outside of the Islamic Republic, hoping to achieve a result. Will this $107 million or the other compensations demanded from the Islamic Republic ever reach the victims' families one day? We don't know. We really don't know how long it will take for the Islamic Republic to do this. The Islamic Republic itself has to decide whether it wants to pay compensation to the families based on a foreign court's ruling. But honestly, I doubt the Islamic Republic thinks that way anymore. They say that if there is going to be a trial, it should be held inside our own country, and our own judges should make a decision. The judges have also decided to pay $150,000, and the figures that other countries mention are not acceptable to them. On the other hand, the families of the victims neither accept the Islamic Republic's court nor the compensation that has been set for them. So in this case, neither side is coming to an agreement, and it's unclear whether any agreement will ever be reached between them or if the Canadian court's ruling will remain symbolic forever. This way, everyone will know who was responsible for this incident and what the court's verdict was, but that verdict has never been enforced. In the end, the takeaway from this video is that all this propaganda you're seeing is either completely false or at best not the whole truth. And if anyone tells you, see, the Islamic Republic wasn't at fault and the Canadian court concluded that only the Ukrainian airline was to blame, show them this video and tell them, no, both the Islamic Republic and the Ukrainian airline were found responsible. And it's not the case that only one airline or one country is entirely to blame for the whole incident.
We had two paths ahead of us. One option was to simply stay at home and completely surrender ourselves to the overwhelming feeling of depression, or instead to make the choice to bravely fight back. There was no other way. We made the deliberate choice to take the second path, which is to fight for what we believe in, and we will absolutely continue this important struggle now and always.
In the end, I hope, truly and sincerely hope with all my heart and soul, that one day, in due course, justice will indeed be served in this case, and that every individual who was involved or at fault, without exception, will be held fully accountable, and that the survivors will, in the end, ultimately receive what they so truly deserve. In your opinion, is Ukraine International Airlines the main party responsible for this incident, or is it the IRGC air defense that fired the missiles and brought down the plane? I read all your comments and will respond to as many as I can. Until the next video, goodbye.